Okay, thank you. Okay, we all are compared to the flower rose. We all are compared with the flower rose. Our skills and talents are those like those rose petals. The more we care our skills and talents, the more our rose looks beautiful. Good morning, this is Chinapadas. I'm a young person from Dream a Dream, joined Dream a Dream in 2012. I'm here from 8 years, 7 to 8 years. I joined Dream a Dream with an intention to make friends, to have fun, to learn about many life skills. And I have successfully learned many life skills, and hope you all have seen my video. Thank you. So, Dream a Dream is a platform which helped me to grow this height. It was a confidence for me, it was a background for me, it was a pushing support for me. And, and today, with Dream a Dream, with the Change the Script help, I'm even leading a team called Change the Narratives. This is about me. Yes. I want to introduce you all, a special person whom I never knew before. But when I started learning, when I read her articles, when I read her some of her books, and I saw her TEDx speeches, I was inspired. Totally inspired. Okay. She is the director at Center of Universal Education at Brookings Institution. Ma'am advises government, international institution, foundation, and conversation on educational issues. Ma'am has spent 15 years in working in the field of education. She has authored articles, reports, books like Leapfrogging Inequality, Why Wait 100 Years for a Change. Let's welcome Dr. Rebecca Winthrop with an applause. We welcome you to our motherland, ma'am. Please come up. Yes, ma'am. Before leaving, I have a small question with you.
Okay.
Small question, which I wanted to ask. So I felt this is the best platform, and I'm standing to a very best person to know that question. So my question is, today the education system, I feel, is outdated. So I personally how can education system help me pursue my interest or passion? So I have been in education system, I have completed my 10th standard, I have completed my undergrad, I am on my undergraduation. So my aim is to become a data scientist. And when I concentrate on my education totally, I lag in somewhere called as my life skills, my talents. That is my, even you have seen my video, which is karate. So I am a sub-teacher, sub-coach over there, who's teaching. So I don't feel time, education is taking me so much. So every day there is new innovations here. So we have to get updated with them and the previous things. So combining all them. So when I combine this all, so I feel I am burdened with it. I have to prepare for my examination, and which usually comes in 6 months when I finish my vacations, and I'm like, oh my God, examinations are on. So, ma'am, please guide me. Then how can I come out of this? Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you. Well, thank you for a very difficult question right at the beginning. It's wonderful to be here. I want to thank Vishal and Sujata, wherever they are. There's one, there they are, who I've gotten to know over the years and have been following Dream a Dream's work from afar, talking to them in many different places where we meet around the globe. And I've been in India for a couple days. I got a chance to visit the after-school program of Dream a Dream yesterday. And I'm just so happy to be here, happy to sort of get a chance to talk to everybody who's been engaged and meet many other people outside the actual Dream a Dream organization. And I mentioned to them last night that the one thing that really stood out to me in visiting the Dream a Dream program yesterday was the amount of joy that the activities brought to the students. There was laughing, they were joking, they were doing this rather difficult exercise of follow the leader, but one person had their eyes closed, one person had their eyes open. And so it was a lesson in teamwork, which is not easy stuff, that's actually hard stuff, but the way they did it, you could just see that the initiative really changed the school climate, the school culture, and it's incredibly important, I think, as we, well, maybe this is a note to myself. You guys are probably doing this day in and day out, but not to forget that education and learning should be fun, not every single moment. There's going to be hard moments. You don't have to have joy every single moment, but that spirit of inquiry and enjoyment and enjoying other people should really be at the core of the learning experience. So thank you again. I have been asked by Vishal and Sujata to set the stage with the problems of the world. So I'm really an optimistic person. I'm a nice person. I believe in humanity, but I'm going to be very depressing for the first half of this talk. But that's because the data is actually very depressing. I'm interested to hear how, have conversations as we go along for the next 2 days on how we can really face this challenge and think creatively. Let's see, what do I have to push? I don't have to push anything. So I started asking myself a question, this question on the wall, can we leapfrog, and really looking at education innovations. And the reason I began asking myself this question was because I did a study. Let's see, how do I move forward? Can you just click forward? Just click one, yeah. I was doing a study because at Brookings, I work at a think tank in Washington, D.C. And our goal, we don't implement programs, we are not on the ground. What we do is really two things. We do research and collect evidence and package it and communicate it in a way that can help inform decision makers, be they in government, civil society leaders, investors, donors, private sector, all of those people who are engaged in delivering education services can think differently and be better informed about their design of their initiatives and their programs. So that's what we do, sort of research to practice and do lots of advising. So I had been doing quite a bit of research on the just very big picture around the globe. What are some of the common trends that we are finding? And basically there's two big, what I call twin problems in education. And they are problems in India. They're also problems in almost every other country in the world. There's some exceptions. There's a few countries that don't really have this problem, but most countries do. And the first big problem, if you can go to the next slide, please. Where am I? I don't think it's working. Just click next. It's fine. Yeah, the first big problem is what I call the 100-year gap. And this is basically, to sum up 3 years of research, that today's education systems, what we have to deliver, most countries' education systems don't deliver the best of what education systems have to offer equally to young people. They deliver it well to children who happen to come from wealthy families and deliver it very poorly to children who happen to come from poor families. And the reason I talk about a 100-year gap is because the pace of change is so slow. If we're not doing anything, the pace of change is so slow is it's going to take about 100 years for poor kids to catch up to rich kids. And the sort of features of the 100-year gap, that's a new one, thank you. You can look at it in many different ways. And one way is to just look at completion and number of years of schooling. Actually, around the world, we have absolutely had a massive increase in access to school. So that has actually been a really good, wonderful occurrence. But we haven't had the same level of success with young people completing all the way through secondary school. So this is looking at regions, a 100-year gap between regions, which is the yellow is the developing world. I'm not sure if you can see on the screen. And the red is developed world. So on average, in terms of numbers of years of schooling completed in the young adult population, the developing world has about 6, and the developed world has double that, about 12. And that is not because the developing world isn't getting their kids into primary school. It's because they're not keeping them there. And learning is a really big piece of that. And the other feature, if you look at the 100-year gap, is really around learning levels. I'm going to switch to a picture of that right now. This is really around looking forward, and it's around learning levels. And this is from a study that shows that the average student in a developing country, it's going to take 6 generations for them to catch up to the learning levels to the average student in a developed country. This in particular was looking at science, but so the 126 years is science, but it's similar to math. It's similar to sort of reading and writing, various other subjects. This is terrible. This is not the world we want to live in. But you can also see this huge gap in different sort of sets of data, and I'll share a few with you now. One is that, again, between sort of developing world and developed world, if you take the average student in a developing country on literacy, the average student, this is, if you assess them mid-primary level or even later on literacy skills, they are basically performing in the lowest 5% of students in the developed world. So there is just huge, big inequalities between countries. But there is also really big inequalities within countries. And the statistic I like to use is from my own country, the United States, but the similar types of gaps are definitely here in India and are in many other countries, where you do also see a big kind of 100-year gap inside. So in the US, depending on the region where young people live of the country, it'll take between 60 to 120 years for poor kids to catch up to rich kids in school readiness indicators. We have a question.
Yes. Do you also have data to show that there are specific interventions that kids who come from the average of the underprivileged society does? Can the 126 years be caught up on
Right.
to interventions?
That is exactly what I started thinking about when I was doing this research, and we'll come to that. And to me, did you guys hear his question? About, what do we do? What do we do with it? That's where I immediately went to. Vishal told me to be negative and dwell on the problems. I also would like to dwell on the positivity, but we're coming to it. And that's when I started thinking about this idea of leapfrog. Like, well, what can we do to just speed this up? But we're not there yet. And in fact, this is only one part of the twin problems. So 100-year gap is one part. So this sort of big education inequality is what it is a huge feature, a dominant feature of most education systems in the world, and it's certainly a feature here in India. There's a second dimension, though, in terms of the twin problems. That's the first. And it's really about today's type of education system, which gets back to your very question at the beginning. Today's education system, how can we deliver it equally to to everybody. The second problem, though, is that while systems are trying to close this 100-year gap, they have to also totally reorient themselves at the same time that they're trying to do this to making sure that young people are developing the relevant sets of skills, abilities, competencies that they need for a rapidly changing world. And I always talk about making sure that education systems have in their mind the sets of competencies young people need to thrive in work, life, and citizenship. The dominant discourse in the policy space over the last probably decade is about the world of work. But I want us not to forget about the life and the citizenship domains. And in fact, that's part of why I'm very attracted to Dream a Dream, because they take a broader perspective. And this is kind of hard to do, actually. If you can imagine sort of big education systems, and there's no bigger education system than India, trying to close the 100-year gap and at the same time pivot. Those are huge change management processes trying to happen at the same time. I have a question. Yes?
Have you also looked into the reasons why there is a gap?
Yep.
We know there's a gap, right?
Yeah, but why? What's the purpose? I mean, where does it come from? Yeah, so the question is, have you also looked into reasons? We'll take two more, and then I'm going to plow forward. Yeah. What is the basis of the gap? Yeah. Yeah. So when we came up with the 100-year gap, and by the way, 100 years is kind of the more or less average. In some countries, it's a little less, and on some metrics, it's a little less. In some countries, it's a little more, and on some metrics, a little more. And what we really did in that 100-year gap study was look at, and I'll spend a little time on this, and then we'll come to your question about what are the reasons in a couple of slides. We really looked at sort of how has education developed over time. And the truth is that this idea of schooling as a way of developing competencies in young people is relatively new historically. This is, if you went back 200 years, young people would develop their skills, their abilities, their competencies, their ability to thrive in work life and being a member of, in citizenship, a member of their community in very different ways. It was apprenticeship, it's with the family, it's through sort of religious institutions. It's all many different ways. Schooling was not a part of average students' life experience, and it certainly wasn't a cultural expectation that young people would, for 18 years, go to this one place for much of the day, for much of their life, to develop their skills and abilities. So in some ways, we were really looking very big picture at where did this idea of universal schooling come from, and what is happening with it now, and where is it heading? Those were kind of our really big picture. And the big takeaways were that actually this idea of universal schooling is an incredible quiet revolution. So 200 years ago, 2 million young people were in primary school around the world. It's not that schooling didn't exist, and we're in India. There's a huge, long, centuries-old legacy of education. It's just for a very small percentage of the population. So this idea that schooling and learning and access to knowledge and truth. It's really this idea of access to truth, which in some places was kept for those who had access to the divine or sort of religious enlightenment. This idea of access to truth is open to every person, is incredibly democratizing, is incredibly hopeful in human potential. And so that part of schooling is really important. And that idea has sort of taken root around the world, most largely with the advent of this concept of human rights. So it's really in the last sort of 40, 50 years that we've seen a massive uptick in mass schooling as a system and in enrollments. So 200 years ago, there were 2 million kids in primary school. In 2010, there were 700 million kids in primary school. And that's many more times the population growth. That was in democratic countries and autocratic countries and countries with burgeoning economies and in countries that were not having burgeoning economies. So it's really this idea of human rights that drove it. And so we want to keep that idea. We don't want to take that idea away. I really think it's sort of one of the world's most amazing revolution. It's a quiet revolution. You don't think about it every day. But it's an incredible idea. The problem is that if you look at sort of completion, so we looked at sort of historically how has schooling spread, and we looked at the gap today, which is in completion and basic levels of learning that we could measure because there were indicators comparable across countries. So there's comparable data on math and science and literacy and years of schooling. That's what we were looking at, because that's really the only thing that's totally comparable across countries. There's a 100-year gap today, and if you don't change anything, the sort of projection is it's going to take another 100 years for those poor kids to catch up to the rich kids of today, not the rich kids of tomorrow in 100 years. So those are kind of the metrics. So let's go back to the skills for the future. There is a growing consensus, I would say, globally in the education community, and everybody has a different term. Every country has a different set of words they use to describe this growing consensus, but there is a growing consensus. And it comes out of the learning sciences. It comes from the pressure of the world of work. Employers who are saying, I don't just need people to really give me sort of regurgitate knowledge. I need them to be able to do many different things. That we need education systems who can help young people develop a broad set of competencies and capabilities. And I use the term breadth of skills. Behind you are lots of different frameworks from different countries, from different NGOs, from different academics, and we mapped many of them. We started mapping them, and we stopped at 300 frameworks and said, well, that's enough. And the basic idea is, you do definitely need rigorous academic competence. All of us in this room have that. So there is a tendency, I think, for some, in some debates to say, oh, no, it's all about 21st century skills. And it's like, yeah, in addition to or together with academic skills. You don't want to not give young people the crucial literacy skills and numeracy skills that they need. But we know that's necessary but not sufficient. So this idea of academic plus is really where I see a growing consensus, at least from the academic community around. And there is also growing interest in the policy world. So we did a large survey of 150 countries, and about 75% of these countries, in their policy statements, in their curriculum, in their vision for what they want their education systems to do, had a breadth of skills vision. They didn't call it that, but that's what it was. And very common across those countries were not only rigorous academic skills, but competencies around communication, competencies around creativity, competencies around negotiation and problem solving. Those are very common. And each country has its own sort of unique sort of subset that's relevant for their cultural context and for, frankly, what the national government thinks should make up a good citizen. And so, if we realize that this is sort of an important piece of what we need to address, it really makes us think through how are we going to get there. Of those countries we looked at, those 150 countries, we had 75% who said, this is where I want to go. This is the vision that I want. This is what I want for young people. But only 11% of them had any plan to get there. So it really is a question of what do I do? What do I have to do differently to make this pivot? I know I want to get there. What are the sort of strategies I need to use? Which gets back to your question. So again, to continue with the sort of depressing news, this is just a snapshot. This came out of a global study led by the Education Commission, which we were involved in incubating and doing research for and with, that was led in part by the UN. If we do nothing, if we continue, just keep doing every year what we did last year in all countries, do the same thing, by 2030, which is the time the UN Sustainable Development Goals should be met, you'll have 825 million young people will not have the basic secondary level skills, not only in literacy and numeracy, but also critical thinking and problem solving. So that's a little mini snapshot of the breadth of skills. What percentage of all the young people in the world do you think that is? It's large. That's the, yeah, half. This is the why piece. That was your question. So in the same report, they looked at this Education Commission report, which is called, if anybody's interested, you should look it up. It's called The Learning Generation. They looked at many reasons, like why is it that we're in this situation? And they bucketed all the reasons into 4 big things. These are sort of the 4 big barriers, but they're also the 4 areas, and this is where we're going to get into more optimism, for transformation. And so the 4 big reasons why, the first one is really around performance. And what they mean by performance is fixing that first twin problem of the 100-year gap. That there's a lot of education systems around the world that are not using some of the basic strategies that we know can help close that 100-year gap. Things like mother tongue instruction. Things like doing basic assessments and using the data to inform your education system. Now, assessments is not really a problem in India, although using the data, I think, is probably a problem. But there are lots of countries out there who don't do basic learning assessments and use learning as sort of, and children's competencies as a way to orient what they're doing in their system. So the report argues that there are several countries who've rapidly improved, and if you just take the top 25% improvers and sort of take the basic sort of policies that they do, and everybody uses those, you'll really improve performance. And again, that really addresses the 100-year gap piece. The second area they identified is that even if every country magically overnight really tightens their system and improves the delivery of education, you're not going to be able to help those 825 million young people develop those breadth of skills without innovation. In part because there's massive teacher gaps, in part because there's very difficult cultural contexts, geographical contexts, et cetera. And you really need to harness innovation. And I'm going to come back to that in the next several slides, really looking at innovation. The other 2 pieces, barriers, were around inclusion, which is we need to have basically pro-poor policies, and that we need to have a strong equity lens, particularly when we're thinking about performance and innovation, and roll things out. The report talks about progressive universalism, meaning start with those most left behind first, and invest there first, and then move up. Because otherwise, the habit is you start with everyone, and the wealthy kids just somehow, by having more social capital in their communities, sort of capture the attention and the resources. So use a pro-equity lens. And then the last sort of big barrier is financing. Lack of money, which in some countries is not a problem, but in some countries really is. Lack of money and the deployment of that funding. And they talk about innovative financing mechanisms. So that leaves us, again, I'm going to focus now on your question, which is, well, what do we do about it? This is very depressing. And and I was very depressed for a while. And I started thinking about this idea of leapfrogging. How can we rapidly accelerate? So just shout out for me, what do you think of when you think of leapfrogging? What comes to your mind? Just yell out. Jump. Well, they're jumping. The frog is jumping. Yes, what else? Mobile phones. What else? Self-learning. Internet. Anything else? Risk. Yeah. So when I thought about this idea of leapfrogging, I was very inspired by what someone said the very first thing, mobile phones. I was inspired by other sectors because I work with a lot of people at the Brookings Institution. I'm in charge of the little education piece, but we have lots of other people who do lots of other work. And colleagues from other sectors, we're doing lots of work on leapfrogging. And so the people working on financial inclusion, you know, in Kenya, they went from 45% financial inclusion to 75% in 3 years. 3 years! And the financial inclusion section had been working for decades to get people who are in poor communities and rural areas access to credit and stuff like that. With mobile banking, all of a sudden, a huge leapfrog. So what would that look like in education? What could it be? And there wasn't we don't have a concept, and I come from both a programmatic but an academic background, so there isn't sort of a defined concept in the global education literature on what leapfrogging means. So I use it kind of loosely, but these are all the different types of things that come to mind when people talk about leapfrogging, jumping ahead, skipping steps, bypassing legacy infrastructure. We're going to come back to that in a minute. Rapid nonlinear progress. Really what I mean is rapid nonlinear progress. And here's the example, as I gave you already, from the financial inclusion sector. So when I looked at what could leapfrogging look like in education, and I compared it to other sectors, I noticed, or I feel, that there's two big differences. You can't just take the concept and plop it right in. Do you guys have any thoughts about what those differences might be? There could be more. What might be different? Context. Education is a human development, people-centric. It's hard to just replicate. Any other thoughts? Yeah, it's not product-based. People have very different access. What about the ultimate goal of education? In financial inclusion, it is very clear. Everyone agrees, and it doesn't matter if you're private sector, government, NGO, what the goal of financial inclusion is. It's access to credit, et cetera. There's no debate about it. What do you guys think is the goal of education? Just shout out. What do you think the goal of education is? Democratic values. Not all countries would agree with that. Lifelong learning. Jobs, earning a living. Get high salaries, get better salaries. Empowerment, right. So even in this group, we've got earning money, democratic values and citizenship, and lifelong learning somewhere in there. So, and I have to say, I've never done this exercise with a group where there's been one answer. So our community doesn't really have a totally shared vision of what a goal is. And if you leapfrog towards trying to maximize on literacy, you're going to do different things versus trying to maximize on breadth of skills. So when I talk about leapfrogging, I've put sort of the line in the sand on breadth of skills. All kids, no matter if they're rich or poor, should have the breadth of skills. They need to thrive in work, life, and citizenship. And I get in arguments, actually, with many colleagues, potentially maybe some of you in this room, but probably not, since it's Dream a Dream convening, that, look, poor kids need to learn how to read, and just focus on that. And I understand that. I understand why people say that. They say, you know, walk before you can run. This is very hard stuff. And I said, look, I don't think we're doing them any favors. Because I do think if we just focus on, you know, core academic skills for poor kids and breadth of skills for rich kids, we're going to have the same 100-year gap in like 30 years from now, and it's going to be around breadth of skills. The other piece that's different is this idea of throwing out the legacy infrastructure for leapfrogging. Nobody in Kenya is going around digging trenches in the ground and laying copper wire to put landlines in. But legacy infrastructure, what's the legacy infrastructure for education? Schools. Schools is the legacy infrastructure. And I personally do not think we're ready to throw out schools. We spent a lot of time getting everyone into school. Let's instead focus on transforming what and how young people learn and thinking a little more broadly about the role of schooling, which includes schools and communities, et cetera, in the process. So to me, those are two big differences. So getting to the question about innovations, or what can we do? So I have spent a couple years looking at education innovations around the world, and I defined innovation as an idea or technology that breaks with current practice in a context that is new to that context, but not necessarily new to the whole world. I want to do a little exercise with you. We're going to make you stand up but not move before I tell you what I found about education innovations. I just want you, as a gut check, you see there's words on the screen, just stand up when I say the word if you feel that word resonates with what education systems are like, if it really resonates with what education systems are like. Just stand up. Okay, resistant to change. Do you feel education systems are? Yeah. I'm glad that the young people are sitting down. That gives me hope in the future. Okay, what about cutting edge? Stay standing if you think education systems are really cutting edge. You don't feel, she's like semi-sitting because she doesn't want to get up again because she sees what's coming in number 3. Innovative. Stand. Oh, come on, you guys are the innovators, really. Yeah, I know. You're doing the right thing. No pressure from me. Okay, political. Yeah, a lot of people standing up. What about fast-paced? Yeah. If you're a school principal, they're really fast-paced. You're making decisions all the time. So what I basically found, and this is a map of, we looked at 3,000 education innovations, just a snapshot, is that actually, well, I can't move. I think I might mess something up terribly, but is that okay? Is actually there's tons of innovation happening. There's tons of innovation happening. We looked at 3,000 education innovations around the world. You'll see India is dark blue, meaning that it's one of the ones that has the most innovations. You guys are a hotbed of education innovation, even if you don't feel it in your bones every day or not, but you are. And the lighter blue is sort of less innovations. Now, again, this is not a census. This is a snapshot. And basically, what did we learn? We learned that a lot of these innovations are on the margin and not at the center of systems. 60% of them are led and implemented by NGOs, less than 10% led and implemented by governments. And so we also learned, which is where my hope comes in, and I hope to leave you with something hopeful, that there are actually lots of great ideas for helping develop breadth of skills for young people, including kids from very poor families. And you don't just have to focus on literacy. You can teach reading and writing and math in difficult contexts in ways that develop full breadth of skills. It is possible. It's not yet massively scaled through a number of systems, but it is possible. And one of the frames I like to use to talk about sort of the principles for identifying what those innovations are is to compare how education systems usually approach their work. So this is the sort of traditional pathway. This is how most education systems have developed over time historically. It's, you see this reflected from the shift from the Millennium Development Goals to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. It's how most sort of governments, when they're thinking about problems, think about them very linear. First, access. First, we build schools. We make them free, we make them compulsory, we do all the things that you want to do to bring kids to school. This is how the US education system developed. Big focus on access, 150 years ago. And then 50, 60 years later in the US, they're in school, but they're not learning very much. We need to focus on academic quality. We got to train our teachers and got to look at those core academic skills. That I think you might see that reflected in some conversations around the world. And then once they're in there and learning the basics of academics, wait, what they're learning, is it even relevant for their lives in work, life, and citizenship? We better think about what the relevance of what are the competencies they need. So that's a very sort of linear fashion. In some systems, that's like many years between each of those. So the challenge, I think, and what we learn from those education innovations that are really helping young people develop breadth of skills, whether rich or poor, is you want to do all of those things all at the same time, which seems overwhelming. And this is sort of a little pathway. We call it the leapfrog pathway on how you could be able to do that. These two here, we talk about core elements, really helping teaching and learning become much more student-centered. And at the same time, shifting the recognition of learning, both how you recognize and see what young people are learning, and we're going to hear more about that later, I think, with Guy, as they progress through school, but also how the receivers of young, educated people, employers, community-based group, faith-based group, recognize their competence. Is it just a high school diploma? Is it other ways? And those are the core. And then to support them, because the scale of the problem is so big, we say it's not necessary, but it's helpful to increasingly diversify the people and places where young people are learning, and as well as leverage technology and data. I'm going to give you some examples of things that fall into those buckets, just to give a quick flavor. And let's start with the recognition in this corner, because most people can see it with the red box, Gold for Gold. This is an initiative that's run by an NGO and partners with companies. It works with government schools in very, very poor townships, places in South Africa where there's very marginalized communities. And basically, they've shifted how employers recognize students' competence. So in secondary school, at the end of secondary school, they do a partnership. And they partner with a lot of companies who are having a very hard time finding what they call finding talent. That means finding people with the skills they need to hire. They first started partnering with the construction industry, because there's a lot of construction companies in South Africa that said, we can't find project foremen, we can't find architects, we can't find engineers, and we're having to go outside South Africa to hire these people. And so what they did is, for sort of that last couple years of senior secondary, they placed young people in companies, and the school was helping with their education, but the people inside the companies were too, and mentoring them and teaching them workplace skills and soft skills is what companies call them often in the business industry. And if companies got a chance to really see these young people up close and personal, and if they said, they have the potential, we think, to be great employees, they would pay for their post-secondary education, and then young people have to come back and work for them. And it ended up that 80% of the young people so far in this program, the companies thought were great and went through and got post-secondary education and are working in jobs. So that's a shift in recognition. We have, down in the corner here, Lima, is a program that's largely across Latin America, and it's really about diversifying people and places, much like Go for Gold did too. But it's board games that were developed by a teacher and refined over the year. Board games, and they're basically mobilizing grandmothers, grandparents, siblings in communities to teach literacy and numeracy through board games. And it's adults learning as well as young kids learning, massively increase the ability to master literacy and numeracy, and does a whole bunch of other sort of interactive, because it's a game and you play in teams, interactive team building, as well as sort of an intergenerational community building component. So that's a great example of you can learn literacy and numeracy as well as other sets of competencies. And again, it's in and outside of school. It's become so effective, teachers have started taking this into their classroom. Down here at the bottom, this is from the US, working with low-income schools, teachers who don't have the ability or sophistication to do project-based learning, and it's a sort of scaffolded online platform that really helps them do that, related to specific curricular subjects. Up here, the Media Lab, one of my favorite, because it's one of the few that's really in our global catalog of innovations led by a government. This was an example from Brazil, a state in Brazil called Amazonas State, which is perhaps one of the most remote rural parts of Brazil, largely Amazon jungle makes up a large part of it. And for a long time, the young people in that state, who lived in that state, only had access to primary school. These are very small villages, remote rural areas accessible by boat. Did you have a question? Stilts, on stilts, says Urvashi, yeah. And the government, the federal government of Brazil said, actually, you guys have your Right to Education Act. They passed an act that said all young people have a right to primary and secondary school. And then they gave space to the state minister of Amazonas State to get creative and figure out how he was going to solve that problem. And he knew that there wasn't even enough young people in high school, in secondary school in the state, who could go on, if all of them went on to be teachers, there wouldn't even be enough people to be to be able to build and staff secondary schools for every community. So he came up with a totally different idea. He took all the teachers, and they're well unionized in Brazil, and he split the teaching profession into two types of teachers. There were some fantastic, largely in the capital, secondary school teachers, because there was a few secondary school teachers, and he made them TV stars. And they broadcast their lessons, and they very much localized the curriculum to their local context, and then he put little two-way video uplink into throughout communities in the state, and kids went to learn their lessons through two-way video uplink broadcast, and they each had a mentoring teacher physically with them who did all the social emotional stuff and did the classroom management and the administrative stuff and the interfacing with the parents if the kids weren't coming to school, right? The champions that you want your teachers to be. So why not? Why not think of, it's hard, one teacher to be both an expert content pedagogue as well as be a champion of young kids. It's a lot of work for teachers. So we took a totally different model. And today, in a couple of short years, all those kids had access to secondary school, and they performed on average with every other kid in Brazil. So it can be done. I will leave you with this before I close, which is just to say this is more detail. This is, that leapfrog pathway I showed you with the 4 buckets. That was a very high-level summary. This is a more detailed summary, or a detailed explanation. And just to say 2 things about leapfrogging. Context really matters. It depends on where you're starting from. And 2, you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. That's not what I'm suggesting. So for teaching and learning, if you've never had schools where you can learn basic literacy and numeracy and you get them to places and you do lecture-based methodology, that's a good thing. Maybe that's a hop. Really what you want to do is lecture-based and more interactive, but you don't want to throw out lecture-based teaching because you're going to need that for some part of learning. And ultimately, what you want is sort of playful learning mixed with interactive learning and lecture-based teaching, so young people can learn and do those types of things. So it really is sort of a continuum. I'm hopeful that there are great examples from our catalog and from all the work you're doing that can give us ideas of how to tackle this. It probably isn't the exact intervention will be able to be used in every place, but the principles behind them, the principles behind the innovation, I think can be very informative. So the Brazilian example could be very informative for people in India working on rural schools. Maybe not the exact way they shape it, but think of those principles because every context will need to sort of make it their own and see what works in their context. And please feel free to read the book. It's available for free online. And give me any feedback. We're starting a phase 2 of this research, particularly around innovative models for teaching and learning. I'd love to hear some of your ideas and stories. I'm also particularly interested in how do we bring parents along with this vision? If, say, tomorrow, if everyone in the education service sector who's supplying education did leapfrog, would parents be with us? Or what kind of strategies do we need to do to bring them along? I would love any ideas on that. And now I think I will stop and open the floor to questions.
So if we see small kids, they have lots of curiosity.
Small kids have lots of curiosity. Yes.
The born kids have lots of curiosity. Once these kids are born, where is that curiosity gone? Why aren't the adults, I mean, after 18 or something, where is that curiosity gone? And is education responsible for maintaining that curiosity?
Be killed, yeah.
So if a teacher have curiosity, students will emerge heavily. So my question basically is, where is that curiosity gone? And is education the culprit which did this?
It's a great question. So you saw on the, let me see if I can go backwards here. Hold on one second. I don't know. Okay, never mind. You saw when I talked about sort of that the education pathway, lecture-based interactive, and playful learning. I like the term, just from exactly what you're getting to, I like the term playful learning, because it recognizes that actually children are born learning, and they learn through play, which is your point about curiosity. And young people learn, we all learn, but young people learn every day, every minute, whether they might not learn what we want them to learn as adults. And for me, the term playful learning is a nice catch-all for many different types of sort of student-led learning approaches. So it's a nice catch-all term. So I definitely agree with you that part of what the education system needs to do is to infuse sort of a playful learning approach, whether that's experiential learning, whether it's teams. There's many different strategies you can use to sort of infuse playful learning. But to me, it's things where learning can be social, you can explore your curiosity, you can iterate, it can be joyful at times. Those are the types of things that characterize playful learning. And I do think that in many education systems, I agree with you, there isn't enough playful learning. And I think people think that it's extra. And I think your point is, why does it have to be extra? Can it be central part of it? And you can learn academics through different approaches that could be playful learning approaches. So I do think education has a big part to play in that. Yes, other questions? Yes? Two here, yeah.
So given the scale of problems we're seeing in the world vis-a-vis climate change or global unrest in terms of terrorism, and the ineffectiveness of education systems to produce citizens that are actually thinking creatively about solving these problems, do you think there's a case now for public education systems to completely decentralize? I'm not saying do away with them, but just question why should they be decentralized, because it's not and just give them back to communities in some way. Or are you seeing any examples of that?
Oh, that is such a hard question. So the Brazil example probably would not have happened without a strong centralized system saying every kid, no matter if they're indigenous from the Amazon jungle or they're in Sao Paulo from a rich family, should have secondary education. So I actually think that you don't want to go free for all. It's up to whatever communities, because there'll be many communities. I did a lot of work in my day designing girls' education programs in Afghanistan during the Taliban and after the fall of the Taliban in Afghanistan. If you totally decentralized, there'd be many girls who would have never gotten to school. So I worry about that idea because I think it will increase marginalization. I think the better thing is to say, how can we have more locally contextualized approaches inside education systems? So, everyone has a right. We want, this is sort of the more or less the, the broad framework of what we want young people to do, and then let communities have a big voice in how to get there. And maybe it could be that half the time kids can learn in communities, right? But if there are sort of sets of competencies that they can show, it doesn't really matter if they got it from a classroom or from interning in an NGO or a company, right? So I think that's the better way to go. Okay, we have 5 questions, and they're giving me 10 minutes. So why don't we 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, like 1 minute each, and then we'll respond. Here.
I have the mic, so I think.
Yeah, you go. Be strong.
Basically.
Assert yourself.
Right. I think I just had a comment, and I think I saw the entire presentation. One of the key stakeholders I feel, specifically, if I look at the Indian education system, primarily has been sidelined is the parent.
Yeah, the parent.
And parents, essentially, their voice, specifically on how they can shape or help shape the education system, hasn't been historically enshrined within the system itself. I think one of the things that, so some of the work that we do is specifically with parents. I think that some of the thoughts that were triggered today from just the young people sort of sharing early in the morning was that a lot of them actually quoted and were talking about their parents being the source of, their whatever achievement that they've made. It's almost, to me, it's a personal thought. I think codifying parents' role just specifically from a narrow perspective of literacy or education could create disservice to the entire idea of how do you engage that stakeholder. It's almost, and I was hearing these guys, it almost seemed to me that one of the biggest roles that parents sort of play is to help them cross these adversities, to sort of take out these adversities from their lives, or at least help them sort of cross them over because their children are young. So just wanted to understand from your perspective, when you talked about the last point, which is how do parents come in? From the way that I see it, it's one of the big roles for them is how do they really help children cross these adversities? What are your thoughts on that?
Okay, great. Parents, let's take it in a circle so we can get a lot of voices in. And then I'll comment on everything at the end to wrap up. Hi, Suman. Hi, Suman. I think your mic isn't on, Suman.
Sorry about that. So the data really threw me back in times. I'm just thinking aloud that this whole K-12 theory about why 12 years of schooling is important must be based on theoretical foundations, proposition, and experience of implementing education across the globe. So I look back in times, and we in India spent almost a decade or more looking at very rightly pointed access issues to begin with, and then moving on to quality. When this whole unrest about we're spending too much time on access was happening, we started to leapfrog. And we came up with some accelerated programs for numeracy, basic skills, etc., which are still live today. And now at this point of time, when we look at quality, we still see the whole population, which are not inclusive as of now, still requiring that accelerated approach. So responding to a call for solutions, for example, by UNICEF, there was a whole lot of proposals which we received from organizations on accelerated programming, reducing the number of years for especially those who have lost the bus. That brings me to thinking that is it going to become a norm, which probably is in some of the communities, when the communities are challenging this whole 12 years, and why should we just spend 11 months and give 5 years of schooling to our child and go on? So the whole legitimacy to that education system, the processes, the feeling, the skills, breadth, whatever, reducing that to 11 months is kind of a danger to my mind. So how do you react to, when we're looking at leapfrogging, what are those non-negotiables that one has to put in place? And you really use things like an aid, an accelerator, but not as the end or means. So.
Interesting. Okay, parents, accelerated learning implications. Who is next? Yes, please.
So part of what you very rightly pointed to is that leapfrogging requires changes in the classroom for transactions or teaching in the classrooms to really change. And I'm wondering whether from your bird's eye view, you see an equivalent in terms of innovations around leapfrogging in behavior change, Because in solutions and innovation, what we see are a lot of tricks of the trade on how to teach faster and identify children. But the agency of the teacher, the individuals involved, are you seeing patterns, or do we need a leapfrogging approach to behavior change?
Right. Interesting. And you're really talking about teacher mindset. Yes. Is that, did I get that right? Okay. Yes.
So my question was, so are there adjacent things that need to happen in health and social security systems so that there isn't kind of pressure of income shock or adversity, which kind of force young people to focus on education as being a pursuit for exclusively work or work objectives, and kind of life and citizenship kind of become secondary objectives because of the pressures of adversity. So for leapfrogging, do we need to do something related to public health and social security at a family level as well, apart from leapfrogging education
as
systems?
like a integrated leapfrog
as a safety
solution.
net from adversity for young people.
Okay,
Yeah.
good question. Yes. Urvashi and then the gentleman in the back. Yeah.
Mine is really a comment to something that you said, Vikram, and then even about the parents. You know, we are assuming in terms of communities, that community, you spoke about democratic values before that. I remember you and I raised our hands about the goal of education. We're assuming that communities are democratic, which they are not. Many communities have their own indigenous oppressions, and in India particularly with the caste system, with patriarchy much in place, my worry about handing over to, getting communities that they will be driving those mindsets, and that's a problem. Whereas perhaps a more neutral system is more of a leveling playing field. That's one. And secondly, about parents, I think somebody mentioned, and I was very impressed with how everybody gave credit to their parents and the young people.
Me too.
My experience with girls, particularly in North India and UP, has been a little different. That many times parents are, especially for girls and fathers, are providing, and the whole community, providing many barriers to girls' education because of early marriage, because of domestic chores, taking care of siblings at home, so that, in fact, they provide the barriers, and much of the resistance has to be for them, right? And in terms of mindsets, I had just one more question, just adding to that, that when we talk about mindsets, I was even thinking of social mindsets, which I think school is a great place, the democratic values, that in leapfrogging for that, because when we talk about developing these breadth of skills, we're talking about developing democratic citizens, then we need changes in mindsets, not just teachers, but even the students and their communities, and do we have examples of leapfrogging in that too?
Maybe okay, 2 last questions, and then we can all answer these questions, all of us, not just me.
Hi, I'm going to add to the diversity of questions here. So you briefly mentioned about the language of instruction, and you said should be taught in the regional languages. While I think the common belief, or the way systems are moving, they are moving towards English as one common language of instruction. Why did you say that, and what was the thought behind it?
Yeah. Okay, last.
I don't know if mine's the last one, but so you've talked a lot about leapfrogging as a methodology within transactions in the classroom. But the other thing you recognized is that perhaps it's like legacy infrastructure or schooling system not really working for what it's meant for. And so I guess my question is, what are the innovations that you've seen happening or that you think are effective in terms of addressing the whole idea of education governance and school systems themselves and making them focus on skills, outcomes, etc.?
Yeah. So I'm gonna stop there because we have to stop, right? Wrap up. Is that correct? Just making sure I'm on time. I'll go backwards. Sorry, I'm gonna stop. Come find me in the Q&A. I didn't look at the enabling environment and the governance component deeply in leapfrogging. To me, that was what remember that chart where there was those 4 big barriers and 4 transformations, sort of performance. I really felt like the governance was in the performance, but that doesn't mean of course there are innovations for sort of system-wide improvements in governance. It wasn't what I was focused on. One of the things that I think is important, if you look at innovations, is sort of demand-side advocacy, holding governments accountable. that is in here a little bit more. But the sort of broad enabling environment that would improve generally performance, that wasn't a big focus. But I don't think they're not important. It just wasn't sort of my focus area. To the question about mindsets, which a couple people brought up, I think there are, and probably a lot of you in this room are working on that. I think there are really good small-scale, not even small-scale, I think of Urvashi, your study hall foundation, and you're doing it across Rajasthan. You're changing teachers' mindsets with the KGBV schools. That is really fundamental, but very hard to do at a system-wide level. So I think there's great examples of nonprofits doing it in their sphere of influence, but how do you bring it to scale? And I do agree that that's probably the most sustainable approach, and it absolutely does need to happen. On Suman, your question about sort of accelerated learning, and we were having a conversation earlier about this really interesting program that CARE India had developed for out-of-school girls, and it's an accelerated learning program. You get sort of the basic primary equivalent in a year's worth of concentrated study. And she said, and then everybody in the community said, well, I'm going to take my girls out of school and put them into the accelerated learning program. So is there like a perverse incentive? But then it also, well, why not? Like, if they're getting the same sets of competencies, like same basic academic competencies in a year, I don't know, do we need to send kids to school for 5 years? Maybe. Now, that would be very hard because daycare is an important function that schools play. So, maybe we need to think a little more differently. Maybe schools should become daycare early on. Now, this accelerated learning program started when they were 10 or something like that, right? So maybe for the first couple of years, it should be daycare. Maybe we should do a year of accelerated learning and get your academics, and then you do a year of service learning. You work as young people in the community. We were talking about this with Henry, in the community, improving something, cleaning up, helping, helping with making your community better in one way or another. Why not? Why not think about that? And I think there was questions around parents. I also noted very much when all of you talked about I Am Because, every single one of you mentioned one of your parents or both, and that they really helped you. And perhaps if they weren't that supportive of you, you wouldn't be here. So I do think that there's many parents who play a really important role in helping get their kids to school, let them study, free up time at home, all sorts of things. But I also was thinking about the parenting question in more of a mindset shift way of what is the purpose of schools. One of the things we did for Leapfrog Inequality book is we interviewed 100 thought leaders around the world, from ministers of education all the way down to sort of really transformative teachers, right down the chain. And all of them had examples of things that would be good for learning. For example, mother tongue instruction. When I was saying mother tongue instruction, I really meant just in the very early years. Not that there shouldn't be a national language, but we really do know that to learn to read in a foreign language from your own is very difficult. And it's hard to do in a place like India with many, many different languages. But you have technology. There might be ways to think about early years mother tongue instruction, particularly in literacy. So when we interviewed those 100 thought leaders, they all had examples of trying to do something that was leapfroggy and good, and parents really resisting the change because it didn't look like school. It seemed different from school. And what are they doing in the community? I'm not paying you, teacher, my fees if it's a private school or sending to government school if you're going to just take them out of school and work with, some community service project. I can do that on my own. So to me, that was the type of thing that I was talking about with parenting. Like, how do you bring them along in a mindset shift to really think about school differently? So I think I'm getting the time. Stop. Notice. So thank you very much. And I look forward to being with you the rest of the time.
Thank you so much. And sorry for those questions that we couldn't get. Rebecca is here till tomorrow evening, so do find time with her. So I just want, before we go for lunch, just unpack this that, it was not a sadistic pleasure. Rebecca, stay with the depressive news. I just wanted to give some context around why we wanted to stay with the problem. And that's another layer of this design that is flowing through, that as we go through day one of Change the Script, we're really just staying with the challenge. It's not to bum us out. It's not I'm not trying to be a doomsday, professing doomsday, but just to stay with it. Because it is a large problem. It is a complex problem. There are so many lenses to it. Every year at CTS, we bring a new lens, and this time, Rebecca has brought this lens of a 100-year gap. So the invitation is to just stay with that. There is a 100-year gap.